Thank you all for joining me this afternoon. I appreciate the time you take to talk with me about things that I think we all find important and really essential when it comes to our religious beliefs, right? Because from the thumbnail, from the title, and the brief description, you can tell that what we're going to talk about is authority. So when you hear that word authority, when you saw that word authority, words have impacts on people based on our familiarity and usage of them, and how others use them, and our experience with others who use them in ways either positive or negative, right? So when you think of Christian authority, right, we can talk about all kinds of different authority and what might come to your mind when you hear that word, see that word. But when you saw Christian authority, what did that bring to your mind? Well, if you're a Christian, right? I mean, the whole idea of being a Christian, while we're imperfect, we all realize that, in fact, at the heart of Christianity is forgiveness because of the things we have inherited generations all the way back to the first one, and then our own desires and tendencies based on what kind of person we've become physically, the spirit we have, all the things that make us who we are, right? We get a chance to either fight against the kind of things we've inherited, the specific types of traits that are more predominant or less in our genealogy, and then learn things, right? We can, just because we haven't inherited a certain trait or desire, it doesn't mean we can't learn them and then start desiring it, right? So it's not all hereditary, it's not all genealogy, but sin is all pervasive, right? Even if we learn something, we're going to make a mistake because our desire will get in the way at some point. That's how it's always been. People have died ever since the beginning. So our faith as Christians is in Jesus Christ, right? That's the whole Christ part of Jesus Christ. That he's the Messiah or Christ. That's the two mean basically the same thing in this context. The one who saved us from the condition of dying all the time. Because we can't stop making these choices that are injurious to ourselves in ways and to others. We can make changes, like I said. We don't all do or say or act in the same ways with the same consequences. But the fact is, eventually sin gets around to all of us and ultimately consumes us. And so we put our faith in Jesus because we believe he freed us from that eventuality. Not that we won't eventually die. That's the whole point of faith in Jesus Christ. He died so that what? He could be raised to life again. We understand a lot of people don't believe this. But I'm just telling you what it means to be a Christian. All right, we're not Calvinists, right? We're not people who are labeling ourselves after the name of someone, a man who claimed to follow Jesus Christ, but who, like many other people, sinned in ways that really show that name has no place next to Jesus Christ, right? Not unless it's we hope you forgive him for the sins he committed in your name and openly shamed what it means to show mercy and forgiveness to people who disagreed with him theologically and for whatever reason, right? He had available to him other means he chose not to use in ways that to even put that name on the same par in any way is out of place. And so we don't do it. We keep our name exclusive to the type of things that we hope and we know from the text show that our faith is in Jesus, right? The one who we actually believe saved, not other people who claim to follow him, whether it's Calvin or anyone else, right? Next week, we will talk more about the scribes, scholars, Pharisees of Jesus' day, and modern apologetic nuts. But today we're going to stay within the confines of authority as Christians. That means you and me, us. So we're not going to be getting off into different theological systems like Calvinism or whatever. I'm just using that as an example, but for me it's an easy one, right? Because we're Christians. So when it comes to authority among Christians, who gives us that? Well, it should come from the one that we actually call ourselves after, right? Or certainly the God that we worship in connection with him, right, Jah? So we're bear witnessing to both of them. Those are our primary sources of information of course, in our view with the Holy Spirit, that they send to us either as a separate spirit person or just spirit personalized, the biblical account is not as specific or clear as it is with Jesus Christ. And so we don't make that an issue. We try to make it simple for people to believe. Right? That's the whole goal, to get people to believe in what? How you can be redeemed, how you can be forgiven for the things that you do wrong, so that you can understand what's going on and you can live better now and in the coming age. What about now, though? Okay, and the coming age, we've sort of talked about it, and we'll find out more about it, right? We talked about it in the resurrection videos with respect to at least kings and priests and the people on the earth and them bringing the fruit of the trees, it seems, into New Jerusalem, whereas they are healed by the leaves of those trees. But in terms of authority, we're only given descriptions and certain, actions relative to the way that those who rule with Jesus treat the nations. Right? So that authority we're not talking about today. It might come up, but we're really talking about today and in relation to the first century, right? Not later figures that do not have the same authority, even according to their own writings, as the biblical texts. So what's the point, right? I mean, we can learn from other people. We can learn from John Calvin. But he's not our authority. We don't call ourselves by that name, at least not if you're like me. So I don't look to him or anybody else but the ones in the texts that we put above everything else, right? If you have other sources of authority, that's different, right? If you have living prophets that you believe give you information in ways that are on par or even more important than the biblical texts, that's not really what we're talking about today. So, you might find some of this content more exclusive in terms of where you're getting your authority and where we're getting our authority. We're talking exclusively about the people who get their authority from the Bible. Specifically, as Christians in our discussion today, the New Testament. Okay? And so, what I want to do is establish for me and you, us Christians, right? What kind of authority do we have? How does that show itself? What does it look like? And what does it mean? Well, as I just got through talking about, we look to primarily Jesus Christ, right? We're Christians. It's Christian authority. It's not church authority. It's not. I understand those get related to it, but let's get back to the basic, item of our interest, and that is Christian authority from the Christ and those who lived or who lived shortly thereafter, the time he was alive, and who were appointed by him according to the best available records and witnesses, like Paul. Right? That's where we're getting our authority if you're like me. Okay, so if you're different, you get your authority later than that, outside. I'm not saying the biblical texts are the only texts that have authority in terms of being, historical, accurate, truthful. Right? That's not what this is about either. But it is, if regardless of what other texts and accounts or even parts of texts you consider equivalent to being in the Bible, maybe some of the apocryphal works, other things like maybe First Clement, things like that. That's okay. Well, all of that should still be consistent with the Christ, right? That's really the starting point if we have the information to use, right? If it's not something Jesus really shows us or tells us about, right, authority, then we can't necessarily go right to him. But I think in this case we can and we should. And then after that, what do we have? Let's take a look at it. So we're going to look from Jesus forward through to essentially John or the one who wrote Revelation. Whether you see those as the same John, it's not the issue today. Okay, don't get off on that. We're looking at the biblical texts that represent essentially the best and earliest records of Jesus and those who lived during and shortly after him. All right, so whether you could include, based on that, something like I said, First Clement, it's still all going to ultimately be consistent if that's true like anything in First Clement or elsewhere, with what we read today or what's in these texts. So let's get right to it. All right, so we're going to talk about Jesus and the example he gave us, what he taught us, what we can learn first of all from him, if anything, about the authority that's in his name, or at least part of it. Christ, Christian. So go ahead and turn with me to John chapter 13. And I'll read several texts. You can comment. I'll try to look at your questions while I'm going through these texts, but I'll mostly get to them at the end of the show because there are a number of texts I want to get to that I think at least will either be usable in the video and for other people, if you're watching, and to read together. And then in the chat, you can talk about them or bring up other texts that if I see, either during the show or later, I'll come back to. All right, so let's go to John chapter 13. I will be reading from the New World Translation. And I don't care what you think, right? I don't claim the New World Translation is correct everywhere. But I'm not here to complain about it either. I know it well. And so if you have a problem with it, that's on you to bring up in the right context, and I'll be happy to discuss it if it fits. Otherwise, it's a convenient text for me to use because I haven't translated every text, and I'm mostly familiar with this translation. So I don't care if you don't like the New World Translation, you don't like the Watchtower. That's your problem. That's not my problem. All right? Let's go to John chapter 13. I say that because I got a comment recently, and it was really, immature and reflected, like I said, an immature, naive desire to be a part of something that they really weren't a part of by commenting in ways that didn't reflect any real desire to be involved with the text. But it was essentially, you're using the NWT, you lost me. Then I never had you, right? You were never listening. Because what do I say over and over about the NWT? It's not about it being correct 100% of the time. You, that commenter, wouldn't have been even able to tell me, most likely, where they thought it was wrong and probably wouldn't have been right if they could. Not based on my experience with people who criticize the NWT unnecessarily. So if you don't like it, you can turn it off or go read the text on your own time. I'm not going to stop more than that or ever again address that issue. If you want to watch these videos and follow along with me, you can do so. No one's forcing you. John chapter 13. Let's take a look. All right. Speaking of no one forcing you. So, Jesus, when he was alive, obviously taught and did many things. And as you know, if you've read the texts related to his life and the texts that speak about, foretell of his time, like those we've been going through in part of my C.W. Jaw Talk series. He's a significant figure, like number 2. And number 2 is really number 1, just as the Son. Right? The Son so worships Jehovah the Father. He only does what the Father tells him. He says that in John chapter 14. We're not going to read it right now. But it's right after 13, which we are going to read, at least part of it. So, Jesus is the one whom John opens up his account by describing as a God who existed with God in the beginning, sons of God, who are gods, John 10, Psalm 82. And goes on to describe his role in creation, just like other texts do. Proverbs 8, Colossians 1, Hebrews 1, 1 Corinthians 8. He goes on to further describe the coming of that one from being with God as a God, in the form of God, just like Paul says, very similar language, same ideas and thoughts. Become a man. And he refers to the one who became a man again in his pre-human form as the only begotten God whom people have seen as he became a man, because no one has seen God at any time. We know Jesus speaks openly about his pre-existence in John 8. We know that Thomas accepts him as his Lord and his God, John 20. Let's see how that one acts. Because I'm here to tell you, anyone who would claim to have any authority over you as a Christian or that you should be listening to them and be submissive as they take the lead. This is what they should be doing. First of all, if they're going to make that claim over you. John 13:1. Now, because he knew, this is John talking about Jesus in a narrative, because he knew before the festival of the Passover that his hour had come for him to move out of this world to the Father, Jesus, having loved his own that were in the world, loved them to the end. Verse 2, so while the evening meal was going on, the devil having already put it into the heart of Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon, to betray him, he, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he came forth from God and was going to God, verse 4, got up from the evening meal and laid aside his outer garments, and taking a towel, he girded himself. Okay, so, this isn't probably something that many people, especially in the Western world, and maybe even in most parts of the world, are familiar with culturally, because it's not common, like it was in the first century, to provide this kind of service to others in ways that would show hospitality. How important that was, very important back then in ways that are missing today, so much so that I had to point that out. That's, again, probably a little bit detached from what we're used to. So just try to picture for yourself, if you can, someone, and in this case, that someone is Jesus, removing his robe, basically being nearly naked, if not naked, in ways that would be appropriate, except for potentially, an undergarment. But it says here he girded himself with a towel, so he may have just disrobed and been naked. Either way, he wasn't obviously exposing himself, right? That's nothing in this account suggests that, nor culturally, historically would suggest that. So try to, again, understand what we're talking about, who we're talking about, and what's happening. We're talking about Christian authority, and we're looking at, this isn't the very first Christian. This is the Christ. There's no Ian, right? We're the Ians. He's the Christ. So this is a big deal for you Ians, if you're like me. This is like the biggest deal and should be a seal across your mind so that you never forget it. Because if you cannot remember it, you won't be able to duplicate it. And if you can't duplicate it, then you have no business claiming authority over anyone. We'll leave the rest aside. Verse 5. After that, he put water into a basin and started to wash the feet of the disciples, or students, right? That's what the term means. And to dry them off with the towel with which he was girded. Okay. So do you understand? You need to see what's happening here. It's more important than me read it and just get through it. Are you with me here visually, right? Have you put aside pretty much whatever else you can and are seeing with me to the best of your ability these people in this room, in this place, and Jesus doing these things? I'll bet you it's really hard for you to do. I'll bet you, and by bet, I don't mean, here's 20 and, you hold it. No, I mean I'll bet in the sense that I would suspect is true that you, like me, are having a hard time, really. I mean, let's be honest here, right? We could put anyone in this narrative and probably make it work quickly. But this is not anyone. Now, how do you think that the disciples felt about this? If so, you and I are having a hard time visualizing it, right? We have the description. We can put things together historically, culturally. We get it. And yet still, Well, they were there. And here's how they acted. Verse 6, and so he, that is Jesus, came to Simon Peter. And Jesus said to him, Peter said to Jesus, Lord, are you washing my feet? Verse 7, in answer Jesus said to him, that is Peter, what I am doing you do not understand at present, but you will understand after these things. Verse 8, Peter said to him, you will certainly never wash my feet. Jesus answered him, unless I wash you, you have no part with me. So what's Peter really doing here? Is he objecting to the hospitality, something that would be common in some respects, and that you'll see actually, happens more than this account? And so, what is it Peter's really objecting to here? Is this unfamiliar to him? Is it weird? Or is he objecting to the fact that it's Jesus? I think he's objecting to the fact that it's Jesus, right? Lord, are you washing my feet? Are you washing my feet? That's how I see it. So, Jesus reaffirms that this is necessary. And so much so, he says, you're done if you don't. What is Jesus really saying to Peter here? Is he that willing to just throw him out? No, what he's really saying is, if you don't understand this, in fact, he even says that, right? What I'm doing, you do not understand at present, but you will later. And Peter says, no, you will never wash my feet. Unless I wash you, you have no part with me. Right? The problem Jesus is having with Peter here, and by problem I mean Peter, just like Peter was a problem other times, right? It still didn't stop him from using him. Either way, so Jesus is basically saying, if you don't understand this, it's not so much, Peter, if you don't let me perform this act of hospitality, even extreme being mean to you, we're done, right? If you don't let me do this common courtesy like everyone else does, I'm finished with you. That's not really it. Not really it at all, right? Because he even says you're not going to understand, but when I'm done, you'll understand. And so he goes on. First Peter says, after he tells him you're done, if you don't understand this, I can't use you. Right? You're not going to be the rock. Simon Peter said to him, okay, Lord, I added the okay, but you understand how it goes. Lord, not my feet only, hands and head too. Okay, if it's that important, you can even go further with it, right? It wasn't really that I didn't want you to do it. It's just that I didn't think you should do it, right? You're the master. You're the Lord. You're the Messiah. Let me do it, right? That's what what's going on with Peter. But Jesus is not accepting Peter's honor, you could say, right? Peter's really trying to honor Jesus in a roundabout way by saying, no, you're too important to wash my feet. That's not going to happen. Let John do it. Let these others do it, So, but Jesus wasn't really testing him for that, right? No, it wasn't really to test Peter at all in that way. He wanted to show them what they should do. Verse 10, Jesus said to him, he that has bathed does not need to have more than his feet washed. He's talking about Peter's comment to go further than the feet, which at this time and in this way, in the way that they laid down when they ate together, was more common and accessible than it would be now with tables and chairs and stuff. He that is bathed does not need to have more than his feet washed, but is wholly clean. And you men are clean, but not all. Verse 11, he knew indeed the man betraying him. That is why he said, not all of you are clean. So sometimes, Jesus knew, wasn't his probably will to have Judas still be among them, but nonetheless, he's following the Father. Verse 12, when now he had washed their feet and had put his outer garments on. Okay, so he disrobes, puts a towel on, goes to wash their feet. Peter objects, tries to give him honor by denying him the opportunity to clean him in that way. Jesus says, no, you don't understand. And if you don't understand and get this and let me do it, I can't use you. That's how important this was. That the one that he really was planning on using and did use, in spite of all his flaws, would have been pushed aside right here if it had been his Father's will and that Peter did not let him perform this act. This is necessary. Right? This was not something that could be tolerated. And this is how I want you to act toward anyone who attempts to exercise authority over you, who acts like they have authority over you, that you must follow them. If accessible, they must first act like that. If not do exactly that. It's got to be that or something equivalent. And I'm not the one telling you that. It's the master. Verse 12, when now he washed their feet, put his outer garments on, and laid himself down at the table, he said to them, do you know what I have done to you? Okay, so up to this point, he probably didn't think they did, right? Even though they knew what he did, right? He washed their feet, cleaned them all. So they're probably like, well, what? At this point, they probably don't know what's going on. But he does. Verse 13, you address me, teacher and Lord, and you speak rightly, for I am such. Right? John 1:1, John 1:3, John 1:14, 1:18, 8:58, 20:28, Philippians 2, 6 through 11, 5 through 11. Think. All of them. You speak rightly. That is what I am. Okay, so if I'm that, I'm number 2, and number 2 is really number 1 because number 2 only does what number 1 does. And so that's my Father. And when you see me, you've seen the Father, which is what he goes on to say not too long after this. Therefore, if I, although, verse 14, teacher and Lord, or Lord and teacher, washed your feet, you also ought to wash the feet of one another. For I set the pattern for you. Right? Not Athanasius, not John Calvin. I set the pattern for you, that just as I did to you, you should do also. Just as I did, you do. Most truly I say to you, a slave is not greater than his master, nor is one that is sent forth greater than the one that sent him. If you know these things, happy you are if you do them. Who's the master? Who's the slave, right? No one has authority to get in between the master and the slave. Our leader is one. There are no other leaders. Anyone else calling themselves a leader in a Christian or religious sense is done. Right? Anyone who tries to rate or put other prominent religious figures in any kind of class or category compared to each or the other is done. They're not in the race. Or they've lost. Or they never started to run. Because I'm telling you that the Son is the one that tells us this is how you act. Okay, it doesn't mean we know that he himself confronted people. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about how we we shouldn't be having anyone else in our way. No favorites, no leaders, no authority figures in our way between the master unless they're doing exactly the same things the master did. And in effect become that master, right? Because then it's okay. In the same way that it's okay to worship Jehovah and his son as Jehovah because Jesus is appointed or given the name above every name? And let me put this up here. And because of that authority, he's essentially acting as Jehovah. Okay, and we accept that, right? It's not a compromise to monotheism. Because the Son is only doing what the Father says, and all glory goes to the Father by accepting him as the Father in that way. Just like with the other angels in the more limited sense, he has it in the fullest sense, at least until when, right? The end of the 1,000 years. What happens according to Paul? He gives everything back to God, the kingdom anyway, so that God becomes all things to everyone. Well, if Jesus was really that in the fullest sense, there'd be no need for that transference to take place or for there to be a difference in effect. And yet, that's exactly what's described. Okay, but it doesn't mean it's just that's his role to that point in time, and we accept him as such, right? My Lord and my God. All right. Well, if in a Christian sense, another Christian acts like this, fine. Right? What would be the harm in that? What would be the harm in acting like this? If they're so special, or they've gained such maturity, or they've reached a level of authority among other Christians, right, in Jesus' name, no less. That better be exactly how that authority is shown, right? You're not given all authority. I'm not given all authority. We can bind and loose in heaven and on earth, but that does not count for us binding and loosing each other. I'm talking about authority among Christians. We're not supposed to be doing that at all to each other. We're supposed to be doing this, showing love. Right? What happened when the disciples wanted to send fire down from heaven to destroy those who were, in their minds, blaspheming? He said, no, what are you doing? That comes later. The Father and the Son and all their angels and those brought with them. That's not now. That's not John Calvin. John Calvin did not have the authority to do what he did. Well, he may have on his own had that authority. But in a Christian sense, what should he have done to those who disagreed with him and whom he felt were deserving of punishment? Merciful, and treated them the way he wanted to be treated, right? It's not hard to tell where he went wrong. But I'm not here to necessarily go on and on about John Calvin, right? I use him because he, like Athanasius and others, have replaced Christian by allowing themselves, or by others making them into figures to follow, right? People who you can look to find historically what was taught in the right way. You know what? We'll just go to the original text. How about that? Even using NWT, and I say even because of its controversy, we can figure it out. Right? We don't need John Calvin. And we sure don't need Athanasius, right? He needed creeds, councils, all kinds of things. We just need these texts. That's what it's about. And probably those who opposed Athanasius said similar things. Right? Because he was not about the text only. That's obvious. He added all kinds of things. So did John Calvin. So do a lot of Christian figures today. And next week we'll talk about a few of them. Not necessarily by name, but you'll be able to tell by the texts we read who the texts are talking about. It's not hard, right? When we read these texts about Jesus and what he commands, right? You ought to do this. Right? It'd be a good idea, you know. And even if he leaves it open, right? I mean, is it really something that you would take in that way? Well, how many of us have done this? How many of us have done this to people that we didn't think really understood what was happening, to try to get to them in a way and show them what's happening? Right? Did these students of Jesus understand what was happening? No, they didn't even understand what he was doing at that moment. He said so. Right here. But he went on and did it anyway. A slave is not greater than his master. If you know these things, happy you are if you do them. Let's go to another text. Let's go to a similar text first. Luke 22. There's another account involving the washing of feet, but before we get to that, it's an important one in this context. Luke 22. Very similar to what we just read in John 13. Luke 22, 23 through 27. Okay, Luke 22, right there. So they started to discuss among themselves the question. This is Jesus with his disciples. Right after he told them he was going to go away and be betrayed. It says, so after that, they started to discuss among themselves the question of which of them would really be the one about to do this, that is, betray him. Verse 24, however, there also arose a heated dispute among them over which one of them seemed to be the greatest. Verse 25, but he, that is Jesus, said to them, the kings of the nations lord it over them, and those having authority over them are called benefactors. You, though, right? Now, see, like I said in the description at the start of the show, I'm not talking about the people outside. We know how they wield authority. And we know that at times when we have to be among them, we have to wield or submit to authority in ways that hopefully allow us to continue living and also continue honoring Yahuwah and the Christ. So, we know how authority is in the world. And to some extent, it's a good thing, just like Paul says, right? That the nations have authority by God to execute judgment against criminals and others who would make it more difficult for us if they weren't maintained. Okay, so we know how that goes. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not. So he refers to them. He says, this is how they do it. We know them. You, though, you Ians, you ones who are going to be me with the Ians after the name, right? Because you're just like me. I set the pattern for you. You are not to be that way. Okay, so right away we know that the way authority is used in the world is really not how it's supposed to go with us. How does it go? Let him that is the greatest among you become as the youngest, and the one acting as chief as the one ministering. The one acting as chief. What do chiefs do? They take the lead, don't they? People follow chiefs, right? They're in command. You want to be a chief? Start serving if you're an Ian, right? We know how chiefs in the world use authority. They govern, they hold it over others, and they either use it good or bad. That's it. You are not to be like that. You're not to be like them. You want to be a chief? Be a minister. What's a minister, right? It's not someone who just puts on a certain outfit and never does anything that would show people that they can manage themselves or protect themselves, or that they're confident individuals, right? They don't just submit to every single thing that ever happens because any kind of resistance is bad. No. Right? We know what we're supposed to do and we're not supposed to do. We have the example in the Christ. Right? So there are times when we'll say things and do things, and there are times when we'll allow ourselves to be taken in. When it comes to how we act among Ians, Christians, you're not to be like the nations. And if you want to be a chief, you want to take the lead, this is what you do. You serve. Right? And how did we see him do that? By washing their feet. By doing lowly service things, right? When you think of people in churches and groups today, and I'm not going to get specific really because other than the ones I mentioned, Calvin and Athanasius, they're long gone. And people continue to use them. So, I find them useful comparisons in certain ways. But when it comes to people today, right, what kind of authority do you see them possessing? Right? What are they doing? How are they handled? Where does it come from? Are they like him? Let's take a look at another example. Luke chapter 7. So we'll just go to a little bit earlier in Luke. Luke chapter 7. I like to scroll. I'll go a little faster though. Luke 7, 33 through 47. All right, in a couple of these texts, there's a few verses, but several that we're going to read are just one or two. So, we'll be getting through them fairly quickly. But I think you're seeing, like me, hopefully, what kind of authority we should be having, right? Or if any, it shouldn't even be something that is really ever discussed except for when we're talking about like this, right? To show what it should be by comparison with others who don't quite seem to demonstrate the same authority as Christians, right? I mean, so you could even use, for example, people like Athanasius. What did they do? He came up with his own set of beliefs or creeds, right? That defined what had to be accepted if you were going to be considered a Christian according to him, or at least similar to it in ways that reflected his views that were not articulated in the text. Same with John Calvin, right? If you didn't believe the Trinity or certain other views of his, you were considered, as good as dead. And there are groups like that today. Or at least you were treated differently in ways like with John Calvin where excessive forms of punishment and execution were used. And they didn't have to be, right? What are Christians supposed to be? Not Calvinists, right? We're not talking about them. I'm talking about Calvin by comparison, but you want to be a Calvinist, and this isn't for you, right? You want to be an Athanasian, this isn't for you, right? You want to be a Watchtower Jehovah's Witness, this discussion isn't for you, right? You need to go to the Watchtower Society and specifically the Faithful Slave for the authority for your views. You may think you get them directly from the text, and you may, but not if they say your belief has to be different. Not if you're going to be a part of their group, right? We can talk about others, right? This isn't exclusive to these people. It really is a problem that is it's all over the place. It seems to infect everybody at some point if you're not careful. And that's why we have these examples. Luke 7, 33. All right, so we know already, and it's funny because I remember, let me just break for a minute. I did this show is really because of a comment I saw by Everett Commodore. And he wanted to have a show about, Christian authority. And so I started thinking about that, and I thought, well, do we really need a whole show about Christian authority? Because I thought, well, maybe I'll just do one of the fastest videos on a subject like that ever. I was going to do like a really quick video on Christian authority and upload it, and it'd be just like a minute or two, and be in response to that question. And my idea at the time, before I did this show, was just to use the account of John 13, read that account, and say anytime someone, a Christian, I should say, claims to have authority over you, and they're not doing this or the equivalent of it in a way that isn't just for the sake of acting like it, right? It has to be sincere in a way that shows this is what they truly believe, right? It should be manifest. It's a pretty powerful activity. When you act like that to someone, it's very difficult to fake, and if it's fake, you can tell. And especially if the person has a high view of themselves, right? Jesus obviously was an important person, but his view of himself was what? Humble, humility. He knew the Father. He knew what he came to do. He knew you, me. He knows everybody. And of course, in the way in the New Testament text for the people he was dealing with. So my thought was, hey, I'll just upload the video. I'll quote that text and say, when they do that, follow them. That's what I was going to do. Christian authority. Read John 13, 1 through 17. And as soon as someone acts like that sincerely to you, go ahead and follow them, right? I mean, so it wouldn't even be something they'd have to ask, right? They would already be acting in ways that would bring you to them because they would be doing the things the Master was doing that brought people to him. So that was my idea because I was really busy. But then I started to realize, well, there are more texts, right? We have headship texts. We have other texts that involve ministerial matters and different types of individuals. And so I thought, okay, well, it's more involved in that respect. But ultimately, really, for me, it boils down to John 13. The second somebody starts acting like that sincerely and over a period of time in ways to help people, not just as an act to get you to give them money or something, I'll start following you. Sure. That should take care of most situations for people claiming to be in a position of authority over you, and you have to listen to them because they're who they claim to be, which we'll talk more about in a minute. Luke 22. So I wanted to break for that real quickly and mention Everett as well for being conscious of the importance of this topic. Luke chapter 7, let's take a look at 33 through 47. Check this out. This ties directly in with John 13, the main text we've been talking about and that I was going to use as the sole basis for my Christian authority video. Verse 33, correspondingly, John the Baptist, this is Jesus talking, John the Baptist has come neither eating bread nor drinking wine, but you say he has a demon. The Son of Man, so he's making a comparison. He's talking about this generation of people, the Pharisees specifically, but he goes on to talk about them and this generation, the people acting like them as he's trying to fulfill God's will. So he starts talking about him. He says, John the Baptist came, and he didn't eat bread or wine. And you said he had a demon. And then the Son of Man, I come eating and drinking, right? I turn the water into wine. You saw me at the place of other people who invited me for food and wine. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, but you say, look, a man gluttonous and given to drinking wine, a friend of tax collectors, sinners. He's not the Christ, right? In other words, there's no pleasing these people. You want someone who doesn't eat or drink? You get John the Baptist. He's a demon. He's got a demon. He's a demonized person. All right, you want someone who's eating and drinking like a normal person? Oh, he's a glutton. So there was just no pleasing these people in ways that even as the Son of Man or John the Baptist, they would find something wrong with him, right? And of course, with John the Baptist, you could find potentially something wrong, right? But although he had a special birth in ways that maybe up to that point, he hadn't done anything openly wrong to the point where they could have condemned him, at least. So either way, he goes on to make that comparison, how they're hypocrites. There's no pleasing them at all. But he's still coming to them, right? He's ministering to these people like he's been ministering to his students, and they're barely getting it, or if at all. And then he says, all the same, wisdom is proved righteous by all its children, referring to himself as wisdom, just like in the parallel account. Verse 36, now a certain one of the Pharisees kept on asking him to dine with him. Accordingly, he went into the house of the Pharisee and reclined at the table. Okay, another visualization moment while I get a drink, right? Because we have a little reading to do and talking a long time. I enjoy it, but I think vocally, your throat will dry out if you don't keep a little hydrated. Very important visualization moment, though. I'll go back to single cam just to make sure that we get... okay, just want to make sure that things are going okay there. And then we'll get back. But let's get to back to Luke 7, 33, and we're in verse 36. So visualization, here's Jesus. He's frustrated with the people, making these comparisons, showing that there's no pleasing them and they're hypocrites. And all the same, he's going to be proven righteous by what he produces, his children. Verse 36, a certain Pharisee keeps asking him to dine with him. Right, the very people he's really condemning or saying they're not being consistent with how they're viewing me or the one before me. So he goes in, right? There's differences among them. They're not all the same, so he can recognize that. So he goes in to recline in the house for dinner with the Pharisee. Verse 37, and look, a woman who was known in the city to be a sinner learned that he was reclining at a meal in the house of the Pharisee. So a woman who's a sinner, maybe a prostitute, probably a prostitute because she was known in this way, right? Learns that he's reclining at a table, or he's reclining at the house for a meal with this Pharisee. So she goes to the house and she brings an alabaster case of perfumed oil. Verse 38, and taking a position behind his feet. Because remember, they don't like sit on chairs the way we do, and more on like couches or divans. And so, but they would be around a table. And so the feet would be out and you could get behind them or around them. So she comes, she's got this alabaster perfumed oil. She takes a position behind his feet. And it says she wept and started to wet his feet with her tears. And she would wipe them off with the hair of her head. Okay, visualize with me again. This is a tough one. We're at the table in the house, reclining, and a woman comes in with a jar of oil, takes a position behind Jesus' feet, doesn't pour the oil on it yet, on his feet, but she covers his feet with her hair, I guess, right? In order to cry over the feet, the hair would likely fall over it. And then she would wipe it with her hair, it says, that was already over it, in a kind of surrounding the feet. So she was able to produce wetness, right? She wasn't sad. She wasn't crying because she was so sad in a negative way. If anything, after all that had happened, she's overjoyed. And it's not too difficult to get tears going when you're overjoyed, especially when you've come to believe the things that she believed about this one. And she wants to show him honor. So she generates the moisture, wets his feet, and starts to wipe it. After wiping his feet with her tears and hair, she kissed his feet tenderly, excuse me, and greased them with perfumed oil. At the sight, the Pharisee that invited him said within himself. So he's looking at it like we are with our minds, but he's seeing it directly. He's thinking inside, not talking openly. This man, Jesus, if he were a prophet, would know who and what kind of woman that is who's touching him. She's a sinner. Right? Probably, if he thinks she's a prostitute in a dirty way, where maybe he thinks that in touching her you'd be unclean because she's been with so many men. So he's starting to have a lower view of Jesus. Why? Why is this Pharisee starting to have a lower view of Jesus? I'll give you a second to think about it. Well, I mean, it says because this woman's touching him and she's an unclean woman, right? Yeah, but what is she doing? She's honoring him, isn't she? I mean, excessive honor. What if she had just come in and laid down a loaf of bread? Do you think the Pharisee would have thought negatively about him or even her to the same extent? I don't think so, right? Because bringing in a loaf of bread wouldn't have been as much honor. And that's why I say it's the extent of honor that she's giving him that's making him not only dwell on how negative he thinks about her already, but the honor she's giving Jesus is making the Pharisee think less of Jesus. This is very important. This is like fundamental to grasping the essence, I think, part of it, of Christianity. And to be able, you need, and I'm not saying this is like special or there's this, it's really right there in plain sight, isn't it? It's just we've allowed ourselves to sort of become removed from the text in these sort of visualizing ways that we're doing, because I think that helps. So what are you seeing? I'm seeing the Pharisee react to the extent of honor she's giving Jesus. If she had just come in, dropped down a loaf of bread and said, "Here, Master, thank you for being in the house and being around our village and all you've done," I don't think it would have been as big a deal. Why is it a bigger deal? Because she's giving him more honor. And I think that's because he doesn't really believe in Jesus yet. Jesus is just a prominent figure. He's a teacher. He's well known. Everyone's following him. Everyone's excited about him. The Pharisee doesn't really believe yet. If he did, and right, I mean, even the disciples don't quite believe yet, so it's not like this is so unusual. There's a lot to believe in connection with Jesus, and that's what we're talking about. So, nevertheless, they're all here. They're all seeing these things, and yet there's something holding this Pharisee back. And he sees this honor this woman is giving him, and that makes him think negatively of her, or really unlock it, and project that onto Jesus. He hasn't done anything. All he did was receive the honor from somebody who, in fact, did exactly what he commanded his disciples to do. If you address me, teacher and Lord, why don't you do the things that I say? I set the pattern for you. This woman, without even having to be told that, understood it. And yet that doesn't make her better than the disciples, does it? Why? Because we're all supposed to be like that. And that's why I said earlier that if somebody says they have authority over you, or if they act that way and expect you to follow them, or if they don't, they exclude you in ways that would have to do with accepting the level of authority they claim. If they do these things, go ahead and follow them. Because you'll then start doing the same things too. And then guess what? There'll be no difference. What did we read earlier when they were arguing about who was the greatest among them? That there really isn't a greatest among you, right? How could there be? You want to be the greatest? You need to start serving everybody. Being the greatest in Christianity among the eons, even the Christ, right, involves serving other people in ways not like we're being taken advantage of, right? What did Jesus say elsewhere? Don't throw your pearls before pigs. Don't throw your valuable things before people who don't appreciate them. Why? They'll turn around, rip you open, and stomp on your things. They don't care. Right? They want what you have. You give it to them, and then just keep giving. They're not really giving you anything. They just keep taking. Well, that's not what we're talking about here, is it? Does it look like Jesus or the woman that we've read about are taking? Right? I mean, now the disciples didn't quite get that yet. But I want you to remember the fact that this woman got it right. The one whom this Pharisee looked down upon the most among the people, and who then he thought of as tainting Jesus, when in fact she wasn't only right, she was ahead of the time, you could say. At least in terms of his followers at that time. But in reply, Jesus said to him, all right, so we have all these things now in our minds. Verse 40, Simon, I have something to say to you, the one who's hosting him, the Pharisee. He said that he here is the Pharisee who's hosting Jesus. So Jesus, after discerning what this Pharisee's thinking, that if this sinful woman, if he knew who this woman was, if he was so great, he wouldn't be letting her touch him like that, honor him to such an extent. Even though he probably wouldn't have minded if she had done something simpler, right? So it's really the degree of honor that she's showing him that making him question it further. But there's really no reason for that unless he doesn't believe Jesus is the Christ. And that's what I think is the case. And Jesus kind of goes on to state that, at least at this time, right? We've already talked about even his followers had a hard time. This woman got it right in spite of her sinfulness. This should be a reminder to us. Simon, I have something to say to you. The Pharisee said to Jesus, Teacher, say it. Verse 41, Jesus says, 2 men are debtors to a certain lender. Right? So there's 2 people in debt. And there's one person who's lent each person money. One was in debt for 500 denarii, but the other for 50. Verse 42, when they did not have anything with which to pay back, he, that is the lender, freely forgave them. All right, so you've got, again, someone with money, or someone with enough money, and he lends money to 2 other people, 2 other men in this case. Different amounts, right? Vastly different amounts. Like 10 times the amount in terms of difference. But they couldn't pay him back, neither one. And the lender forgave them. That's not common, right? That happens, right? People are very generous at times in ways with material things, and this is possible, right? This is a believer. Certainly not the most common, though, right? I mean, most people would expect you to pay them back, and in fact, you would be expected to pay them back. But in this illustration, okay, let's stay with the illustration and the point he makes. In this illustration, there's a very generous lender. And he lends to 2 people. And he forgives them when they can't pay back. So he goes on to say, which one of them, he's talking to the Pharisee, will love the lender more? Verse 43, Simon the Pharisee replies, I suppose it is the one to whom he freely forgave the more. And Jesus says, you judged correctly. So the Pharisee says, well, the one who was in debt more likely is more appreciative of the one who was not in as much debt to the same person. And Jesus says, that's correct. Verse 44, with that he turned to the woman and he said to Simon, right? So at this point, Simon doesn't know. Simon does not know that Jesus knows what he was thinking a minute ago. So Jesus is talking to him about something, and Simon doesn't realize it connects directly with what's in front of his eyes and in his heart. So after he goes through the illustration with Simon and gets him to see it right, you can always put someone in another scenario involving different components but the same essential qualities and value, and it's an easy way to teach people by value substitution, right? By substituting different things with the same values, you can get people to appreciate different things the same way, whereas they might not previously because of other intervening factors. In this case, Simon's lack of faith, right? So he gives him the illustration, knowing what he's thinking, knowing his lack of faith. And then after the illustration is clear and Simon gets it and Jesus agrees, right? The point has been made. He turns to the woman and he says to Simon the Pharisee, do you behold this woman? I entered into your house. You gave me no water for my feet. This woman wet my feet with her tears and wiped them off with her hair. You gave me no kiss, but this woman, from the hour that I came in, did not leave off tenderly kissing my feet. You did not grease my head with oil, but this woman greased my feet with perfumed oil. By virtue of this, I tell you, her sins, many though they are forgiven. Because she loved much, but he who is forgiven little loves little. So, what's the point? My point is, it doesn't make a difference. It doesn't matter whether you were forgiven $1 million or whether you were forgiven $100. Those aren't equivalent currencies and terms. But my point is, isn't that Jesus' point? It doesn't matter. Right? One may love one more than the other, but that's between that person and the master. So there really shouldn't be any difference when it comes to what matters among Christians unless you're following the master, right? So If the master accepts the woman as doing the thing he told his disciples, if they didn't do, they'd have no part with him. If that woman is viewed on equal terms and as, in fact, someone who loves more than people who are less sinners, I'd like you to show me an authority chart for that. Because it's really going in the other way, isn't it? Just like Jesus himself showed us in John 13. And now we have the woman showing us. Right? Whereas the men who were with Jesus, at least at this time, right? They did what they had to do. They did things the woman couldn't do. Many things. But in this, she got it right. And I will tell you that the way Jesus views her is pretty significant, is it not? So that being the case, that Jesus himself set the pattern, and that a woman like this, whom he approved in the presence of a Pharisee with whom he is dining, in order to make it as he said, so that even though her sins are many, they are forgiven, and what she did would be read, like we're doing. If that's the case, I just don't see how anyone claiming authority over others, acting as though they actually have authority, right? I'm not talking about people who just take the lead and start going, right? You follow them because they're doing the thing like Jesus did. That's the right pattern, right? That's how you act. They're showing. Just like this woman, right? Is she not showing? Is this not how we're told to act in John 13? Okay, so if that's happening, you'll already know. Did the woman have to be told to do that? No. She already knew. Now, there again could be equivalent things in ways that, like I said, that may not necessarily be what we can do today. My point is, there comes a time when you realize that the authority you have is to be the Christ. And I'm going to show you that more. Now, 1 Corinthians 11, verse 3. All right, so Christ has the authority to be what? Jehovah, God. And how does he act? Well, he acts just like Jehovah, right? He's given the name above every name. He sits on his Father's throne. He does only what the Father tells him, all to the Father's glory, for 1,000 years relative to the kingdom, and then he gives it back. Right? All good. All part of what Jah wills and desires, and nothing against him. All right, so now as men who follow the Christ, isn't that how we should act? If we're following the Christ, if Christ following God means he does what God does with the authority and the position that he has, and you saw how he acted, right? Well, what did John 13 show us? And we claim to follow the Christ, then that should be how we act. And if women claim to be equal to men, or at least following men in the Christian sense, right? A lot of women today claim to be equal, when equality is really, it's not even possible, right? We're both different ways that aren't better or worse, they're just different. There's lots of things that are different and not the same and are not equal, but that aren't necessarily better or worse, specifically genders, but lots of things that have those two genders. My point is, specifically in relation to this, the model is perfect. 1 Corinthians 11:3. So if Christ follows God and acts the way he acts and is therefore given that name and authority, and if as men we are told to act like the Christ, we're Christians, and if women believe that as members of the body of Christ, they are essentially the same, there's no difference in that sense, right? We're different members, we have different roles, just like different parts of the body, but we're all ultimately one in Christ. Well, that being the case, there shouldn't really be any difference, right? Just like we read a moment ago. What did the woman do? She did the same thing Jesus did. Well, the men, they just were having a hard time at that point, right? And again, what did we read? It was Peter trying to over-honor Jesus And I say over because it wasn't what Jesus wanted. It wasn't like they were just totally unaware of what was happening. They knew he was doing something that was subservient in a sense, but they rejected because of who they viewed him as. So it wasn't like they were totally bad when it came to what they should be doing. They just didn't understand at that time how they were supposed to act, right? What were they doing? They were arguing over who was the greatest. It said that in part of one of the accounts we read and elsewhere. All right, so they had a problem with that. Well, the woman did not, right? Because she's looked down upon. She's not really in that discussion. And yet she did something that all of those who were arguing who were the greatest, that's how important they saw themselves being with Jesus at that time, even though they didn't understand. She was better than all of them, right? And what did Jesus say? The one who is greatest must what? Be the one serving. That woman was greatest among them. She was the one serving. Jesus was greatest among them. He was the one serving. They couldn't figure out who was the greatest among them. Why? None of them were serving. 1 Corinthians 11:3. Well, we'll start in verse 1. Become imitators of me, even as I am of Christ. We just talked about it, right? Christ imitates God. We imitate Christ. And then women are supposed to be in the image of man and God. And so if we're all one in Christ, we should be following the same way. And what does that mean? Doing the things of the Christ. He set the pattern for you, for me. Become imitators of me, even as I am of Christ. Does Paul say, become imitators of me, even as I am imitators of John? Does Paul say, become imitators of me, even as I become imitators of Mark? No. Right? Does Paul start talking about, there's all kinds of different, Christian people out there that you can view, here's my top 10 favorites and all that stuff? No. You're not supposed to have any of that. The Christ. You imitate me, why? I imitate the Christ. Okay, that's it. What is Paul? What is Apollos? What is Cephas? Nothing. Except planters. It's God that makes it grow. He says that. So if we're nothing in that sense, how could we possibly be something in comparison to anyone else? We can't be. Not in the Christian sense, right? Because the one who is greater or better in that sense is lower, serving more. Not someone who's just, thought of as like the best. Right? You have to be showing. Happy are you if you do these things, Jesus said, not just hearing them. Become imitators of me, even as I am of Christ. Now I commend you because in all things you have me in mind, and you are holding fast the traditions just as I handed them on to you. Right? Okay, so the things he learned and taught that we're going to get to further in a moment. Paul also knew there were others who were appointed, like Peter, who were teaching and directing others, sometimes right and sometimes wrong. But he's talking, of course, about the traditions that he learned either directly through revelation from the Christ. So he's not just, someone later on. He's one of the early followers of Jesus in a direct, real, the resurrected sense. And so the traditions that he learned through those revelations and through his application of these texts, which he does in all his writings, all the things he's talking about, these things, right? These are the traditions right here. Whether you are eating or drinking or doing anything else, do all things for God's glory. There's a tradition. Keep from becoming causes of stumbling to Jews as well as Greeks and to the congregation of God. There's a tradition. Okay? So what's another tradition? I want you to know that the head of every man is the Christ. And what is it the Christ showed us? John 13. If you don't do this, you have no part in me. I set the pattern. In turn, the head of a woman is the man. In turn, the head of the Christ is God. And he goes on to talk about different things relative to the woman and men with respect to certain spiritual activities that we're not going to get into in great detail because I don't think it's necessary. Again, quite honestly, whether man or woman, if they are taking the lead in ways that show they're following the pattern of Jesus, right? They're washing their feet, they're doing the ministerial activities, they're not just saying, they're doing, right? They're not really even in word asking you to follow them, they're just leading. Follow them, right? You show me someone who's actually doing what Jesus did, doesn't think they're better than him, how could that be wrong? Was it not the woman who was praised in comparison to the man in Luke 7? Not that women are always supposed to be over men. That's not what we're teaching, or even the teaching of Paul. It's not an over or under thing. It's who's taking the lead. All right, well, the men are in the image of God to take the lead. That's how he made us. And woman in the image of man to be with man to praise Jah. Where's that a problem? Isn't the man expected, based on certain physical and other positional things, to do certain things that might be, in one sense, more work, whereas a woman in another sense has to work harder? So these aren't things that make one better. They're just different roles that we are assigned based on how we're made. Well, then within each of those genders, you have different types of women. You have different types of men, right? Not every man is as masculine or as strong. Not every woman is as nurturing or supportive or confident as some. So it's not a simple as making two class things and saying these do this and these do that. But it is as simple as saying do this. Follow the Christ, right? Do we not have records of women being mentioned, not only like here with respect to this sinner, but even in the Christian congregation by Paul and others in Acts and elsewhere? And do we not have women being singled out by Pliny in his letter to Trajan as those who stood fast to death in the early 2nd century? So let's stop making this such an issue that we can't all wash each other's feet, right? You start doing that or the equivalent thereof, you won't even be worrying about it. You won't even know about it or think about it unless something comes up, right? If something comes up, people are needed in a certain place to do a certain thing or to help someone, what are you going to do? Well, what's the need? Who are the people? Where's the place? Who's available? Okay, is it something a man should do because of physical issues or certain social structures or just certain positional things that are better suited for a male to take part in? Or are they the kind of thing where a woman would be better suited to, able to deal with either other women or children or certain men who just don't respond to other men very well? I can't tell you. There's all those conditions and more that we need to be able to meet. And if we're so inept that we can't get along and follow the Christ, well, what's the point of the text, right? Why are we reading this at all? Well, we know why. Let's go to 1 Corinthians 16. We're going to be wrapping things up in probably a half an hour here. I'll take a look at some of your questions or comments if I can in a moment. Let's get to a couple more texts. 1 Corinthians 16. A little bit later from the text we just read from Paul, talking about the headship, right? So you women should not be thinking of men as your head as being a lower thing at all or in any way dishonorable. That would be like saying it's dishonorable for Christ to have God as his head or for man to have Christ as his head, right? It's not meant that way at all. It's the wicked one and others who use it that way against you so that you become even less than that. And so to keep you from that fall, if you accept certain things in ways that just like men, right? Accepting the Christ as our head doesn't mean we don't make decisions. That's the whole point is he gives us an example and we accept it. We follow it. Of course, women and men, we're all sinners. So it's a little bit different kind of arrangement, right? We have to put up with each other more than, say, Christ could be considered a burden or difficult for us. His commands might be considered, they shouldn't be. But you see what I'm saying? People can make it more difficult because of our sin. Nevertheless, this arrangement is beneficial in ways that if we can forgive each other, continue serving each other. Who's the greatest? Show me the one serving. I'll show you the greatest. It's not the one in the special clothing. It's not the one in the special hats. It's not the one with the special staff. It's not the one in the special place. It's not the one who wants everybody from every place to follow them, or even most, or even some, right? It's the one who's doing the things that Christ did. That's how we know who's taking the lead among us. That's how we know who we should be following. Stop thinking about man or woman. You'll know what you should be doing when you see what should be done being done, or doing it. Instead, we sit around and ask these theoretical or practical questions about things that could happen. Let's just get going. Let's go get it done, right? How can we help grow and inspire other people the way Jesus did? That's it, right? There's a lot more in terms of belief and stuff, but foundationally, right, is that not what he said? I'm teacher, I'm Lord, you're correct. So if I do this, what's your excuse? Or what's next? Right? What did that woman do? Right? Instead, if as men, Christian men, we want to take the lead, well, that doesn't mean we just go throwing ourselves at everybody's feet, of course, right? That's, no. It's situational, just like it was with Jesus. Right? That was the first time he did it with Peter, because it was necessary at that point to prove a point. And so in a similar way, there are things that we can do to show how we genuinely feel toward others in a serving sense, especially our brothers and sisters. Whereas the disciples and us at times, we tend to fight among ourselves about the exact opposite, right? Or if we're really looking for the greatest, then we should be the one serving in the midst of the people we're arguing about being the greatest, because that would be showing it. You want to be the greatest? I can show you how. I have the answer. Serve your brothers and sisters, not in a mocking way or in a way just to try to demonstrate that you can perform this act. Right? It has to be genuine. Do you really feel that way after reading the account in John 13? Do you feel that impact? That the one who was a God with God as one of the sons of God, the Son of God, the firstborn, the only begotten God, the Messiah. Right? We saw how when you read that account, how does that make you feel? When you read the account about the woman in Luke 7, how did that make you feel? Right? Didn't it make you want to be like that woman? Whether you're a man or a woman, I'm not talking about the femininity or the act. Same with Jesus, right? It's the act. That's what has to happen. Enough of all this talk and structuring and division. Let's see some action. And then you'll see people taking the lead with their action. You'll see people following them because they're following the pattern. And ultimately, they're not following the people. They're following the one who set the pattern. Right? That's why Paul says, I follow the Christ. What are you talking about? I'm nothing. Cephas is nothing. Apollos is nothing. He didn't mean they're actually nothing. Right? Are they not handing on traditions? Paul wasn't saying, look, don't listen to anything I have to say. He's saying, look, if you don't find what I'm telling you to be following this pattern, then you shouldn't be listening. Right? I'm nothing. It's the one I'm following that's something. Just like Jesus said. What did Jesus say? No one's good. Right? I'm doing what he's doing. It all goes up to the top. Right? It's a very similar pattern. Now, when we get down to the bottom, when we get past the Jesus to God and men to Jesus part, and we get to just humans, men to women and men to men and women to women, it's a little more tricky, as I said, because of the sin. But that's the pattern. And we just have to keep trying to follow it. And with our sin, we have to apply forgiveness. That is essential because we're going to sin. And if we don't forgive each other, that itself is a sin. And so we just condemn ourselves. Make no progress. 1 Corinthians 16, 15 through 17. Now I exhort you, brothers, you know that the household of Stephanas is the first fruits of Achaia, and that they set themselves to minister to the holy ones. May you also keep submitting yourselves to persons of that kind, and to everyone cooperating and laboring. There's your example. There is the pattern following Jesus Christ, right? What does he say right here? Or it was in 1 Corinthians 11, right? Become imitators of me even as I am of Christ. Well, right, he not only point out the headship arrangement that shows Jesus following us following Jesus, and then in the same way having a headship arrangement that's according to the Christ, but he says that we should be submitting ourselves to persons like Stephanas, who he goes on to write about, and others that did things in ways that show nothing of the kind of being, lordy over others or being a burden financially or otherwise to people. No, the exact opposite, in fact. So it says he says, submit yourselves to persons like that, and to everyone cooperating and laboring, right? Does he say here that we have to submit ourselves only to people who are considered elders or ministerial servants or people with certain type of specific authority? No. Everyone cooperating and laboring. Well, what was Jesus doing in John 13? Looks like he was cooperating and laboring to me. What was the woman doing in Luke 7? Cooperating and laboring. What does Jesus do to the Father or to God in terms of the headship arrangement? He cooperates and he works with him, right? Well, what do we do in terms of our headship arrangement with the Christ? We cooperate and we work with him, right? We need that. Well, we have to be able to do this together. And if we can't, we have a problem following the Master. That's the problem. You follow the Master, you have no problem. I guarantee it. This is a Greg Stafford guarantee. Very rare. And I'll probably never give one again. But this one is a guarantee. Follow the Master, and you won't have any problems. That doesn't mean you won't have any problems, right? Because we make mistakes. Other people make mistakes. Problems. I'm just saying if you do what he did, that won't cause you a problem in and of itself. And so Paul says, look, submit to everyone like that. This submission idea we've come to believe, I think, in terms mostly in terms of men and women, and then different men in the Christian congregation. But really, the submission is a much broader aspect of our Christian devotion to the Christ. It's really not to each other. It's to the Christ, even though in direct sense we may be submitting ourselves to persons of that kind in imitation of the Christ. Right? We become him in that sense, the same way he became a servant to us. All right, let's go to another text, 1 Peter 5:5. Remember, I said a few we'd get to pretty quickly. We'll be wrapping up things here in about 20 minutes. 1 Peter 5. I'm trying to show by all these texts and a few more that we're going to get to, Christian authority, right? It's this odd concept that combines what it means to be like Christ, which is anything but an authoritative person, except for, I'm not talking about, again, the kingly authority or positional authority he's given. I'm talking about the pattern he set before he was given that in the way that he then began to exercise, which we will also do later too. Or we will also do later. I don't need the two. I said also. Either way, we need to be able to show the right kind of authority and submission in this state right now. This is the most difficult part because we have to fight sin. We have to fight other beliefs and ideas, practices, people who abuse authority, whether Christian or not. So I'm limiting this show to the authority among Christians. how we should exercise it, what it involves, how we recognize it, what we should do. Well, there really isn't no authority that we have to follow in the sense that we have favorites or they're our leader, right? Or we call ourselves after them, right? We don't call ourselves Calvinists or others. Other people may do. We don't. We follow the Christ, and we will imitate others who imitate him. Right? If you want to imitate me, it better be because I'm imitating him. Or maybe I'm showing you something more culturally significant and relation to principles that I follow from him, but that's more practical in terms of something that I've done versus what he's done, right? We know that not every single thing that we do in relation to a Christian principle is something Jesus has done. But it has to be based on either something he's done or a very clear principle that he teaches. That's how you have authority. Did he not say that? You want to be the greatest? Be the least. Well, where's your authority? If you're the least, if you're serving, I'm here to tell you right now, you have zero authority. None. How could you? Where are you having authority? Not while you're serving. I guarantee you that. It doesn't mean you do have authority in other ways with respect to the teaching of God and what he gives you in terms of your property and people of the world. If you pray in accordance with his will, it will take place for you. But where it concerns each other, you don't have the authority to do very much other than to serve, right? But then we get into these differences in doctrine, right? We've talked about Calvinists and others, so we know it's not that simple now. This is why we call ourselves Christian Witnesses of Jah, of course, or at least some of us do, because we have to differentiate from others. So I'm talking about among me and you. Remember I said earlier, I'm not talking about people who get their authority from the creeds. I'm not talking about people who get their authority from different councils or from different teachers. I'm talking about people who get their authority from these texts and these texts alone. You can learn all kinds of things from different people and others. You can believe in other texts, like I said earlier. But they have to be consistent at least with these, do they not? If you believe like me. Because these are the foundational documents that best represent what Jesus taught and did, and what those who were with him and who lived shortly thereafter and experienced him, like Paul, believed and taught. All right, so 1 Peter 5:5. I wanted to get to that. And then make those points about men and women and different individuals. Next week, I'm going to talk more about the Pharisees and scribes or scholars of Jesus' day. Probably a little bit more about Athanasius and maybe Calvin. But maybe not. I'm definitely going to get into some of the more modern apologetic nut groups or practices. And so in that way, I may get a little into Calvin and others, but who are a little more recent than, say, Athanasius, but who nonetheless divided Christianity further, and who people look to today in ways that continue to divide it, when really we don't need to be looking to anybody or anything else but these texts, unless it's someone today that can help us do that very same thing, right? Not with other creeds or words or definitions and ideas and doctrine. We have all that. Sometimes we just need help putting it all together, but making sure we're true to it nonetheless. 1 Peter 5:5, so we can benefit from each other like that, right? We're all members of the same body working together. Paul just said to submit yourself to people like Stephanus and everyone of that sort. So we should be looking to each other. And in fact, we shouldn't even have to be. I guess I should say we should already be practicing that degree of submission that doesn't require this kind of definition. But we are where we are, right? Jesus and the disciples were where they were in John 13. Simon the Pharisee, Jesus, and the woman were where they were in Luke 7. Okay, fine. Here we are. What are we going to do with the rest of our time? 1 Peter 5:5, in like manner, you younger men be in subjection to older men. It's not always easy to do, right? In spite of what Peter writes here, we have Timothy, right? A young man whom Paul said, don't let anyone look down on your youth. Right? So Timothy had to endure the kind of subjection to older men that he was told to do, not only by Paul and by Peter here, but by ones who were looking down on his youth. So you women, it's not always, I got to deal with the way this man is taking the lead because of the way the text reads and says. Well, it's men too. Men who are younger are told to submit to older men, not where we can clearly see they're wrong. I'm going to show you that next. But where we know they're right. Just like Jesus Christ. So, nevertheless, that involves submission. Right? It involves allowing ourselves to become subservient to older men, others who have shown over a longer period of time, at least in the case of many of the men spoken of here, faithfulness. Right? Why wouldn't we do that? Just like we would our Father. We can appreciate and respect and honor people who have demonstrated the qualities and things we believe longer. Makes sense. There's nothing unusual about that. Why wouldn't a woman submit herself to a man who's taking the lead and demonstrating what it means to follow Jesus? A woman has to do that too. Well, what's so bad about that? If the man has to submit to Jesus and essentially do the same things he did, including serve others and wash their feet if necessary, and the woman has to do that too, and is even praised over the men who didn't do it by Jesus, I just don't see the problem. I see people creating a problem where in the best practice of the text, there is none. So he goes on to say, but all of you gird yourselves with lowliness of mind, all of you, toward one another. What did I say earlier? And I was even going to do just a brief little video in response to Everett that said, someone claims authority over you, or you want to claim authority over other people as Christians, as a Christian, do John 13 first, or the equivalent thereof culturally significantly. Once I see that shown and demonstrated by a person who's taking the lead and expects people to follow him, I'll go, man or woman, right? I have the text to show. John 13, Luke 7. Now you just show me people doing those things, and I'll be the next one to follow. Until then, I'm going to do the best I can to follow the lead of the ones whom the text describes. And in taking that lead, I hope I can inspire others to do the same, right? I shouldn't have to ask people to do the things that are right if I'm doing the things that are right. We're not talking about mistakes we make. We all make those. We're talking about people like that woman who was a sinner. And in spite of those, was praised by as worth more than the one who thought less of her, by the one who mattered more than both. Let's take a look at another text, Hebrews 13. Hebrews 13, this one comes up a lot in the context of authority, and certainly in groups like the Watchtower and others where you're told to basically just listen to what they say, right? Submit. Don't have differing beliefs, even if you think you're right and they're wrong, even if it might matter to the point where you could lose your life or relationships, and you still think it's not biblical. Right? It's not like you disagree with the Bible. You just think their interpretation of the Bible is wrong. Watchtowers like that on some beliefs. I'm sorry. And they have been. Other groups are too. If you don't interpret it like them, you're done. So they require obedience to the interpretation. The obedience isn't required to the text. What are the three things I require of other people? Right? Belief in Jehovah as the one God, the Father. Belief in Jesus as the Son of God, the one whom he sent forth from heaven as the Messiah. And treating others the way we want to treat ourselves. We all know those are in the text, right? Explicitly. Pretty much just like that. Or they would be in the ways that I would accept. So I'm not requiring you to do anything but accept these texts and the examples that they show. So there's your difference right there. When you see a group requiring you to be submissive to interpretations of the text versus the text itself, or where am I going wrong, or how am I asserting authority over you if I'm simply saying, have this view right there in the text. Don't need to add anything to it. Athanasius couldn't do that. Calvin couldn't do that. Watchtower can't do that. We can do that. That's a big difference. Hebrews 13, 16 through 18. Moreover, do not forget the doing of good and the sharing of things with others, for with such sacrifices God is well pleased. Be obedient to those taking the lead among you, and be submissive, for they are keeping watch over your souls as those who will render an account, that they may do this with joy and not with sighing, for this would be damaging to you. All right, and one more. Carry on prayer for us, for we trust we have an honest conscience, as we wish to conduct ourselves honestly in all things. All right. So the kind of people that Paul, or the writer of Hebrews, is talking about here are clearly those who are looking after them, right? And they're serving, right? They're basically the kind of people that we read about earlier in Jesus, John 13, and the woman, Luke 7. They're serving these people that he's writing to. They're taking the lead, and they're keeping watch over the others. Well, wasn't Jesus doing that? Wasn't he looking after them in serving them? He even prayed to his Father to continue watching after them after he had gone. John 17. So everything he did, and all of his submissiveness to his Father and to them, in spite of being Lord and teacher, is this what he's talking about right here. What would be damaging to you if they're not doing it joyfully but with sighing? How would that damage you? I'll tell you how it would damage you. It would damage you because they would start to probably regret, as a human, a sinful human or imperfect human would do to someone who doesn't appreciate, right? Who's not allowing them to do the things that show they're following Jesus Christ. It would probably be more difficult for them in ways that would affect the service they're giving to you. It doesn't say you cut them off. It doesn't say you shun them or you stop accepting them because they won't let you serve them. He's talking about those who take the lead and being submissive in the same way he said to be submissive to everyone in 1 Corinthians 16, who showed the same attitude as in Stephanus. Well, that would include men and women. And would that not include also the illustration we gave earlier involving Jesus and the woman who did the very thing that he told his disciples that they should do, but that they didn't understand at that time? That's taking the lead. Taking the lead isn't you run the place, right? You own the building, and if people don't follow your interpretations, they're out. Right? It's okay. The Bible tells us not to be among those who openly reject Jesus as the Christ, or who don't receive the word hospitably. So we're not talking about being able to control your own house or your own place against people who don't appreciate what you're doing. We're talking about what it actually means to have authority as a Christian. What are you supposed to be doing? You're supposed to be acting like the Christ. You're supposed to be doing the things he did. And so until we see that, or you see that, in anybody claiming authority, you shouldn't even have to ask the question whether to follow them, whether they're taking the lead, whether you should be submissive. Submissive to what? Submissive to them reminding you of what the text says? Okay, I'll do it. Submissive when it comes to imitating the Christ and what he did? Okay, I'm interested. Submissive when it comes to accepting every single one of your interpretations, even though you've changed many of your interpretations? No, I won't do it. And you know who else wouldn't do it? The Apostle Paul. Let's go to Galatians 2. Chapter 2. And see what he says. I highlighted this also in my Pleasing Others open session. Let's take a look at part of it again. Galatians 2:1. This is the Apostle Paul. This is Paul, the one to whom it is written in Acts Jesus appeared to and who converted from being a persecutor of Christians to being one of the most prolific writers, the most in terms of the biblical text. and the number of documents, letters that he wrote. Here's what he says in part of one of them. After 14 years, I again went up to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking also Titus with me. So this is Paul with Barnabas and Titus. And he's going to Jerusalem, where there were at times many of the apostles and the council of those who assisted in ways that involved how they were dealing with people of the nations and the Jews in light of Jesus coming as the Messiah and fulfilling the law. So Paul goes back to Jerusalem, where that group at one time was, and at times in differing degrees existed, really the center of early activity in many ways. He goes back there after a long period of time. He says he went up as a result of a revelation, and he laid before them the good news which he's preaching among the nations. All the things that happened to him privately, though, before those who were outstanding men, right? People with, you could say, authority, would you not? If they're considered outstanding men at this time and in this way. Now, the authority should be like we've been reading about in Jesus and the accounts. And probably, maybe that's what Paul's talking about. So he seeks the ones with that reputation out in Jerusalem for fear that somehow he was running or had run in vain, right? So he's looking for the people that are taking the lead. He's looking to be submissive. Is he not? He goes up to Jerusalem, takes Barnabas and Titus, and he goes to lay before outstanding individuals, people he saw as outstanding in terms of the Christian congregation, the good news. Because he didn't want to be away from them, right? For fear I had run in vain. And then he says, nevertheless, not even Titus, who was with me, a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised, although he was a Greek, right? So here Titus is going before this prominent body of individuals in Jerusalem with Paul. And neither one of them were compelled by what they were being told. Why? Because of the false brothers brought in quietly, who sneaked in to spy on our freedom, which we have in Christ, so that they might completely enslave us. There's the wrong kind of authority. There's the authority of the nations, right? Remember, that's how the nations act. You're not supposed to act that way. Let me show you how you're supposed to act. But we still have these problems, right? Just because we know how to act, we have other people who don't know how to act, or if they do know how to act, they still don't act that way. Instead, they want to enslave us and act this way for their own benefit. So if Paul and Titus, and Barnabas, I guess, but Paul and Titus, since they're singled out in a certain way by Paul here, as not, listening to these individuals, if they had just gone there and accepted that in Jerusalem's where the approved body of Christ is, that the faithful and discreet slave, you could say, right, in the Watchtower sense of things, right, the prominent or the authoritative body of anointed people. That's how the Jerusalem body is essentially seen in Watchtower terms, as the equivalency in how they see the governing body in relation to all of the anointed class. So Paul, it'd be like maybe someone else of the anointed going to Bethel, and getting there, and with other people who are just, they're coming there to tell their experiences in the Christian ministry and stuff. They get there and they find all this other stuff going on. We look for the members of the governing body, right? And the prominent men, the ones who are supposed to be outstanding among us. If we just go there and just because of where we are and because of who they are and the authority we allow them to have, we could be totally misled, totally deceived. Right here in the text, it says we did not yield by way of submission. Right? What did the writer of Hebrews say in Hebrews 13? Be submissive, be obedient. Well, why didn't Paul just be obedient to them? Why didn't, when he got to Jerusalem and he's looking for the outstanding men that he's heard about and knows about and wants to share the good news with, why didn't he just listen to them? Because they were teaching false doctrine. They weren't just pointing to the texts. right? They were trying to enslave them all over again, or if they were pointing to the text, it was the fulfilled text of the law, right? So it's not about just submitting yourselves because of who people think they are, who you think they are, where they are, how long they've been doing something, who they know. It doesn't get any more prominent than this. And what does it say? We did not yield. We did not submit. No, not even for 1 hour. 60 minutes. We didn't do it. Why? So that the truth of the good news might continue. We can't preach 3 things and then burden that with 1914 chronology. We can't preach the golden rule and burden people with you can't take blood transfusions. We require it. Right? Even if it's wrong, that's for them to decide, right? We're not masters of people's faith, and it's not explicit in that regard. I'm using it as an example. You see what I'm saying? Right here is your example. If you can't do this, then you don't believe Galatians at least, or Paul. Because right here, he's giving you an example of what you would have to do today. If you went as someone with good intentions to Bethel, for example, if we're using Watchtower, it could be other groups, and you get there and you find things going wrong, what are you going to do? Not do anything? Because they're outstanding men? They're the governing body? I can't talk to them. They can't be wrong. Wrong. They can be wrong. They often are wrong, and they often have been wrong because they're trying to be too right. And that's wrong. All right. So that's clear. Now let's take a look at even another example. Revelation chapter 2. So that's Paul, right? We already have the example of Jesus and the woman over and against the man who knew the law, the Pharisee. Revelation chapter 2. Now we have Jesus directly in his resurrected form, according to the account, speaking to his followers about others who claim to be his followers in a special sense. Revelation 2, 1 through 3. To the angel of the congregation in Ephesus write, these are the things that he says who holds the 7 stars in his right hand, he who walks in the midst of the 7 golden lampstands. I know your deeds, this is Jesus talking, and your labor and endurance, and that you cannot bear bad men, and that you put to the test those who say they are apostles, but they're not, and you found them to be liars. You are showing endurance, and you are borne up for my name's sake, and you have not grown weary. Right? Labor and endurance. Right? Remember what Paul said about submitting ourselves to those who showed the same labor and who are doing the same things as Stephanus. So these are obviously people like that. They're enduring, they're showing labor in those good works, their deeds, can't bear bad men. And they put to the test people who say they're apostles, right? If you're an apostle, you're sent forth. You've been sent by someone. Someone has given you authority, right? If you're an apostle, you are sent in the authority of the one who sent you. These people who didn't claim the type of authority specified here, the ones whom Jesus said were showing labor and endurance, they were putting to the test others who were openly claiming to have been sent by the Christ. Now we saw Paul. He passed the test. But not everyone has been sent by the Christ, right? Paul was subjected to Paul turned the tables around, right? He was so faithful. He started showing them where they were wrong, directly according to the text. These people were found to be liars. You cannot find out if someone's a liar if you can't even question them in the first place. And if they require you to question them in ways that is just ongoing and never stops, I don't see how it's possible that you're not going to find a problem, right? We've stopped. 3 things. That's it. Everything else is between you and Jah and Jesus. Because we all stand or fall in that way. We'll read the text. Look down to verse 18. And to the angel in the congregation of the congregation in Thyatira, Right. These are the things that the Son of God says. He who has eyes like a fiery flame and his feet are like fine copper. I know your deeds and your love and your faith and ministry and endurance, and that your deeds of late are more than those formerly. So what we do, how we act and treat others is constantly in his sight. And whether or not we put to the test others who claim special rights is also something he sees and approves if we do it rightly. How do we do it? We use the text. That's our authority. Everything else would have to be consistent with it anyway, right? If we accept that Jesus came and taught all these things, and those who followed him earliest of all taught these things, everything else then that we accept as correct has to be consistent with those things in the religious sense that we're talking about, right? And that's why we have problems with people like Athanasius and John Calvin, because they're not consistent in critical respects when it comes to the things the text talk about. So, yet we have all these figures, all these people claiming authority. What do we do next, right? As I said earlier on in the video and at times throughout, it really boils down to this. Are they doing the things the Master did? And is what they're doing compelling you to do it next? If so, do it. Because I don't see how that could be a problem if you're imitating them as they imitate the Master, right? Paul says what? Imitate me as I imitate Christ. That's it. There's no other form of imitation of people or benefiting of teachings related to the Christ than that which is consistent with the text. That is the basis for our accepting him as the Christ. Right? Let's take a look at one last text. Romans chapter 12. All right, so we kind of talked about, the washing of the feet. And we talked about ways that we could show uncommonly to how people tend to believe of authority, that we actually have authority by being submissive in the Christian sense, right? Not as the nations, right? Not trying to be the greatest. We have to do that at times, either to keep our job, right? Or just to be involved in the world socially the way we're required to be. That's that. We're not talking about that right now. And we should not be talking or acting like that when we're together. Not if we're trying to be Christians. We have a lot of changes we need to make in things that we've done or that we should do that will allow us to become more reliable examples for others to follow. But it starts by us following the reliable example we claim to follow. Romans chapter 12. So we've talked about the feet washing, the lowliness of mind, all these things we should be showing to people in the Christian sense if we claim authority in the Christ. And then they follow us, right? There's our authority right there. We're being imitated. Why? Because we imitate the Christ. Well, Jesus' authority is what? Where does he get it? By following Jah, by imitating Jah. You see? Same arrangement as the headship in 1 Corinthians 11:3. It's the imitation of the head that allows us to be what we follow. And in terms of men and women, the arrangement there's a difference because we're all sinners, of course. And in one sense, we're all one in the Christ. Nevertheless, different in respects that are also described specifically in the Bible that we should be able to show. Because that's what Jesus showed, right? Right? Think of the woman in Luke 7. What did she do? She wet his feet with her tears and wiped his feet with her hair and perfumed them. The Pharisee man did nothing. Yet she's an example. He is not. Who do you want to be? The disciples were arguing who was the greatest among them. Who has authority? Who's number one? Who should be teaching? Whose tradition should we be following? Jesus then became lower than all of them in their midst, even though he was greater than all of them in their midst. Right? So even if as teacher and Lord in their midst, he became lower than them, That's the only authority you should follow. Not the ones who refuse to allow you to question them on their interpretations. Not the ones who exclude you from their following because you don't follow every single one of their interpretations. But the ones who are following what the text clearly says. The unequivocal things that show what it means to be a follower of Christ. That's Christian authority. And when you do those things, right, then the greatest becomes the least. And in becoming the least, you become the greatest. Romans 12. Let's talk a little more descriptively. We'll read 1 through 10 and wrap it up. Consequently, I entreat you by the compassions of God, brothers, to present your bodies a sacrifice living, holy, acceptable to God, a sacred service with your power of reason. Quit being fashioned after this system of things, but be transformed by making your mind over, that you may prove to yourselves the good and acceptable and perfect will of God. For through the undeserved kindness given to me, I tell everyone there among you not to think more of himself than is necessary to think, but to think so as to have a sound mind, each one as God has distributed to him a measure of faith. For just as we have one body, in one body many members, but the members do not all have the same function, so we, although many, are one body in union with Christ, but members belonging individually to one another. Since then we have gifts differing according to the undeserved kindness given to us. Whether prophecy, let us prophesy according to the faith proportioned to us, or a ministry, let us be at ministry, or he that teaches, let him be at teaching, he that exhorts, let him be at his exhortation, he that distributes, for his giving, let him do it with liberality, he that presides, let him do it in real earnest, he that shows mercy, let him do it with cheerfulness. Let your love be without hypocrisy. Abhor what is wicked, cling to what is good. In brotherly love, have tender affection for one another. In showing honor to one another, take the lead. Take the lead. Showing honor. All right. So these are pretty clear teachings, are they not? It's not like a prophecy or a complex set of texts we have to decipher. These are clear-cut statements, clear teachings of how we should be acting, how we can take the lead by showing honor to one another. What did Jesus do? What was Peter objecting to him doing? Showing honor. Too much, Peter thought, right? You can't know. If you don't let me do this, you're done. Right? I mean, that's how important that was. Right before they were arguing who was the greatest. That's how Jesus replied. Jesus goes into the house of the Pharisee, and a sinner from the city comes in, honors Jesus. And that honor caused the Pharisee to think less of the one being honored, and to think nothing good at all of the one showing the honor. We can't be like that. We can't be like that, or we'll just be looking down on honor. And the danger for us is that we are not yet, we'll say, united enough in ways where we can clearly see each other, so we know to a fuller extent with whom we're dealing, right? But did they not have that as well? Right? Paul went back to Jerusalem. Paul went back to Jerusalem after a long period of time and sought out the people that he believed were the most prominent, right? I mean, they were the ones in Jerusalem, the quote-unquote governing body that had given counsel on matters, and had been taking the lead as apostles and others associated with Jesus before he had come. He gets there with Titus and Barnabas, 2 other Christians, and they want none of it. Not even an hour's worth of submission. So when it comes to being obedient, being submissive, the best advice I can give is that any person who's acting like you should be following them, meaning they're upset you're not listening to them and doing what they tell you to do, versus just doing what they believe and you either doing it too or don't, right? The ones who want you to submit to them are bothered by it when you don't. That's the whole point, right? That's the idea of having people submit to you in the wrong way, the way that the world does. It's because you want them below you. And yet in the Christian way, it's the exact opposite. Is it not? Is not the one who was the greatest among us the one who became the lowest? Was not the woman who, even according to the law, wasn't the same as the men in that scriptural sense, that men were given authority over women? And yet, by what she did, she actually was viewed by Jesus as more. So it wasn't about him being a man and her being a woman, was it? It was about her doing what mattered more. And so I say, to the extent that any person does what matters more versus tries to get you to submit yourself to them over things that really don't matter, follow that one.